Section 3 of the Universal Religion, Bahaism, its Rise and Social Import. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. The Universal Religion, Bahaism, its Rise and Social Import, by Hippolyte DREYFUS-BARNEY. Section 3. The Great Prophets. All these different prophets, whose teachings the Holy Scriptures have preserved for us, represent therefore one and the same force, one and the same spirit, one and the same intelligence, one and the same truth, God. And under whatever sky they may have appeared, in whatever epoch they may have lived, they all have given to humanity the same teaching, more and more perfect, more and more complete, according to the evolution of humanity. And accordingly, the wonderful reciprocal influence of the Prophet on his people, and of the people on their Prophet, appears natural to us in its divine signification. For the role of the Prophet, in order to be understood, in no wise demands a belief in miracles, and let us hasten to say that for a Bahai there is nothing supernatural. Revelation is not considered as something miraculous, supernatural in the vulgar sense of the word. The supernatural should only be understood as that which constitutes the higher spheres of nature, the vast unknown domain, into which, however, by the investigations of thought and the researches of science we are permitted to penetrate more and more every day. Revelation is only the result of a mystic penetration into this domain, the closer communion of some privileged souls with the great intelligence which presides over the advancement of worlds. This communion, this consciousness that man has of his place in the world, this relationship in which he feels himself with the rest of creatures, from his nearest to the most distant tribes, and to all beings of nature, is precisely what legitimates his place on the summit of creation. And the greatest man, the Prophet, is a being who appears from time to time, in whom this consciousness surpasses every other sentiment, and who acquires thereby an influence which the greatest conquerors or the greatest scholars never had in history. One of those, and the latest in date, was Baha'u'llah, whom millions of individuals from the four corners of the earth, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Christians, Jews and Mohammedans, recognize today as the greatest manifestation of God, and who thus groups around him those who till now seemed irreconcilable. He was born in Persia, in the luminous Orient, whence have come all the prophets, by this mysterious law which wills that, just as the sun rises in the east, it should also be from that quarter that the great leading lights of humanity appear. Perhaps a like phenomenon can be sufficiently explained by the purer sky of those climates, or by the larger part given to meditation and to introspection, in a life where the difficulties of existence seem less great than elsewhere. I should now like to show briefly how, among the fanatical Mohammedans of Persia, a movement has taken place which today appears in the world as a lesson of liberalism. Babism. At the end of the year 1852, the Persian and Ottoman governments agreed to exile to Baghdad a certain number of families whose presence in Iran, according to what the chiefs of the Orthodox religion said, constituted a scandal and a danger to public peace. As a matter of fact, for nearly 8 years, Persia had been the theatre of one of the bloodiest religious conflicts that its history ever had to register, since the day when the ancient Parsi civilization had given way before the sword of triumphant Islam. But neither the persecutions of the fanaticized crowds nor the effort of the royal armies were able to succeed in mastering those who had declared themselves disciples of the Bab. It is known how, in 1844, the masses had been suddenly raised by the young reformer, announcing that he was the Imam Mahdi, the prophet of the pure lineage of Muhammad, whose reappearance had been expected for centuries by the pious. Note: for all which concerns the history of the Bab and the early times of Bahaism, see the book by A.L.M. Nicholas entitled Sayyid Ali Muhammad dit le Bab, du Jarec, Paris 1905, and also Religions et Sociétés, Alcan, Paris 1905, and E.G. Brown, A Traveller's Narrative, written to illustrate the episode of the Bab, Cambridge 1891. End note. Whom he had now come to prepare for the apparition of him whom God would manifest. If his movement had finished by a seeming revolt against the clergy and the conservative orthodoxy of Persia, certainly it was not one against Islam, for, on the contrary, the Bab claimed to accomplish in his person all the prophecies of the Qur'an and the Hadiths. Had not Muhammad received the assurance from Jibra'il that God would bring religion from the sky to the earth, and that it would reascend to him in a day whose length was to be 1,000 years? Note Qur'an 32:4. According to the popular legend, just 10 centuries had passed since the mysterious disappearance of the last Imam, who had finished establishing on earth the religion of the Prophet, which for these 10 centuries had been corrupted by ignorant priests. What did the divine word signify, if not that the moment had at last come for religion to ascend to its original celestial purity? This was the reforming work to which the Bab had invited his compatriots, at the same time showing them how to free themselves from the material and intellectual misery in which they were kept by a government helpless before the prevarications of officials and by ignorant mullahs whose only anxiety was to retain their lucrative prestige. He had urgently exhorted them to prepare for the coming of him whom God would manifest, the great prophet whom all the holy scriptures had announced for the last days. Although the Bab had not meant to propagate his doctrine by sword and fire, but, on the contrary, had called everyone to discuss with him the truth of his claim, yet it is easy to understand what hostilities such ideas would meet with from all those who for one reason or another held any power. The whole country at once arose for or against him, and ardent missionaries set out from north to south and from east to west to spread the good news. One of them, and not the least famous, a woman, Qurratul Ayn, is incontestably among the number of the most powerful personalities of our time. The majority of these missionaries set out with such zeal to spread the cause that it even cost them their lives. But the blood of martyrs never flowed in vain under the executioner's axe. It filtered into the Persian soil, and, in spite of hostile fanaticism, produced an abundant harvest of generous ideas sustaining to humanity. The Bab himself, who, since the day of his proclamation, had been dragged from prison to prison, after a mock trial was executed on one of the public places of Tabriz in 1850. Meanwhile, the revolt was gaining the whole country. His death, which followed that of his principal disciples, did not stop the movement which he had started. Whole crowds were converted to Babism without even having read his writings, without knowing anything of his doctrine but what had been transmitted from ear to ear. They only knew that a new era of liberty and progress was about to begin, for the triumph of which thousands of Mohammedans had not hesitated to sacrifice life, and that a new prophet was to be expected, the great manifestation of God, whose annunciator had been the Bab, as John the Baptist had been the annunciator and forerunner of Jesus. Note: it must, however, be remembered that the role of the Bab is not limited to that of annunciator, and that the reform of Islam, to which his name is attached, and which was the point of departure of Bahaism, has caused him to be considered as a great prophet, the bearer of a new law, in the same way as Baha'u'llah. On the different kinds of prophets, see Some Answered Questions, page 188. End of section 3.